Welcome to the What About series, where we talk about therapy topics in a highly condensed and easily digested way.
Our goal is to help the average person understand some of the more complex or misunderstood aspects of the mental health world. Let's get right into it.
Let's do it. All right, welcome back to another episode of the What About series. Today we're going to be talking about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, can be a heavy topic, and it's a disorder that affects a lot of people. So
yeah, it's the only anxiety disorder, and yes, that's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's an anxiety disorder that actually is created through an outside stimulus.
So
kind of interesting there.
The other anxiety disorders is typically inside.
Yeah, more internal
conflict. Yeah,
and then PTSD is the only one that's created by that main trauma, that the main
stuff we're going to be learning about today.
Thing that starts. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So maybe you have a loved one that suffers from PTSD. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't, and you just want to know what it's all about. And so that's what we're about here on What About Therapy.
I think also it can be thrown around lightly.
Yeah.
The term PTSD, because I know
PTSD.
Yeah, I've used that a lot. I try not to, because those that really do struggle with PTSD, it's no joke. But we tend to kind of throw it around, like when we have a memory come up, you're like, oh my gosh, it gives me PTSD of like high school or something. And sure, that could be a PTSD,
like a tidbit, I don't know, like
really
a small
symptom, but an experience, kind of like PTSD, but it's not. And so just be aware of that. Is most of the time when someone says, oh man, that gave me PTSD, like, probably not.
Yeah, it's like the same thing with most of it. It's like people will say, oh man, I'm so OCD about this or that.
Yeah.
But if they really had OCD, they wouldn't be like, because people who really have OCD are just, they have a really hard time. Same thing with bipolar. Like, oh, I'm so bipolar. Like, then there's people who actually have bipolar and they suffer a lot. And so, if you do that, I do it too. We all do it. It's just one of those things that shouldn't be taken very lightly, because it is a very serious thing, especially for people who've experienced some really heavy traumas.
Right.
And, because it can affect every aspect of your life when you struggle with this. So, as always, we have the same framework for every episode: a summary with symptoms, risk factors, diagnosis, and treatment. And we're going to get right into the summary here. So this comes from an article, and all the articles we're pulling from, we're always full disclosure, we'll put them at the bottom of the show notes or description.
Yep, will be linked down below.
And you can go through and read through them yourself. Great resources if you want to learn more. So first one here, direct from the article, says the post-traumatic stress disorder. This is actually from WebMD, I believe. But yeah, post-traumatic stress disorder, once called shell shock, or battle fatigue syndrome, is a serious condition that can develop after a person has experienced or witnessed a traumatic or terrifying event in which there were serious physical harm or threat. PTSD is a lasting consequence of traumatic ordeals that cause intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Examples of things that bring on PTSD include sexual or physical assault, the unexpected death of a loved one, an accident, war, or natural disaster. Families of victims can develop PTSD, as can emergency personnel and rescue workers. So, summarizing that up into a bite-sized fashion, PTSD is basically reliving past traumatic events that happen to you as if they are currently happening in the moment. So the symptoms and all the things that, when you think of PTSD, it's basically you've experienced something in the past, whether that be abuse, or it's very common amongst veterans that have been to war and things like that. It can get set off through different reasons, but you basically relive the traumatic event, just sitting down, laying in bed. You experience these symptoms that you experienced at that moment, feel the same feelings you felt during the trauma, for no reason at all, seemingly, and at random times.
Yeah, and those are some of the symptoms. Well, these symptoms we're going to talk about here later in this episode. And if you can hear little thumps and little noises here and there, that's Zuko running around, just being the wild animal that he is.
Being a dog, literally just being a dog.
Yeah, he's wild. Like right now, he's just chewing a ball. Like, what a life! What a life
to be a dog.
To be a dog. So to move on here, there are 4 ways to develop PTSD. Like 4 main ways. I'm sure there are little branches, but these are the 4 main categories. If you've experienced some of these, or just 4 experiences that you can have that can give you PTSD. So the first one is through direct experience, so something directly happening to you. And this one is also very common with, like war veterans or victims of rape, things of that nature. They'll develop PTSD. Not always, but they can develop PTSD through that direct experience. Second is as a witness, if you saw something traumatic happen. Third is learning that it happened to someone else, which is really interesting because, before learning more about PTSD, in the past recent months, I didn't know that you could get PTSD from like hearing something happen to someone else, which I think is really interesting. And the last one here is exposure to aversive details. So hearing
like there was
too much.
Good example of this is like after 9/11, the constant reruns of people watching the planes hit the towers or hearing about it in the news or reading about it in the papers and hearing about the terrifying stories like across the country in different places. That's how number 4 would kind of apply, that just too much exposure to details of a traumatic event can cause PTSD, which is crazy.
It is really crazy. It's a good example there. And so 3 and 4 are kind of tied together. Learning that it happened to someone else, and then exposure to aversive details. I think number 3 is more focused on learning that it happened to someone you know.
Yeah, like a loved one.
Yeah, like a loved and close one. That's far more likely to develop PTSD through that. Because if it's just a random person, then really... Probably not. Yeah, very unlikely. Not saying impossible, but it's more likely to occur when it's someone that's close to you or someone you know.
For like a spouse, child, things like that.
Yeah.
But, Enoch touched on this, but one thing we wanted to note is that not everyone who experiences trauma will develop PTSD. Like let's say two buddies go to war, they experience the same type of things. One will develop PTSD, one won't. Like not statistically, but that's the kind of what we're trying to say here is that not everyone develops PTSD based off of a traumatic event, but another thing to remember is that anyone can develop PTSD, and it can develop from almost any kind of trauma. It doesn't have to be any specific type. Like the big one we keep saying is war veterans, but it doesn't have to just be that. It can be anything from sexual assault to a car crash to like even a divorce, like the traumatic events of a divorce. It could be so many different things, and so we don't want to limit that. If you feel like you have PTSD symptoms over something that doesn't seem like you could get PTSD from, maybe you do. Let's maybe look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, because like we've said several times, a lot actually on the podcast, is that we're all so different, we're all so unique, and we can experience the same thing. Like Austin and I can record this podcast and have different experiences because we're all just so different. And there's so many things that we've all experienced differently, like in our childhoods, our birth orders, our DNA, whatever it is. There's so many factors that play into that. And so like Austin said again, don't feel bad because you develop PTSD over something that might not seem as grandiose or as bad in quotation marks than another person who has PTSD, because something that might not be bad for you or someone else might be really bad for you, just in the way you experience it.
Yeah. Great. So now just going into the symptoms here. So we've kind of broken this up into 4 different areas that it can affect, 4 different subcategories, I guess.
Yeah, and this comes from an article through psychotherapyacademy.org. And again, this will be linked down below if you want to read that whole article. I really highly recommend it. It's great, and you can go more into detail with all of these subcategories of these symptoms.
Great. So number 1 here, one of the 4 areas it can affect is trauma. I guess, what did the article say on that? Like, maybe you could elaborate on that since you kind of pulled from that one.
Yeah, so there are 4 different kinds here: trauma, intrusion, avoidance, and cognitions. And so the first one, if trauma, is the symptom is, the symptom is really the thing that started it, in a sense. Does that make sense?
So is the event itself?
Yeah, the event itself. So the 4 ways of trauma that we just talked about: direct experience, witness, learning it happened, and exposure. That is one of the symptoms. Because if those things happen to you, with PTSD, those things have to happen in order to develop PTSD in the first place. So
that's number 1. The actual event is a symptom. You actually had a thing that caused it. Like we said earlier, it's the only anxiety disorder that has an external force that causes the disorder itself.
Yeah.
or the anxiety disorder itself. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, the first symptom is the traumatic event itself.
Yeah. The second here is intrusion. So intrusion, as in like invading, if you think about it that way, invading your mind, intrusion. So things like distressing memories, and these are kind of the things that I think people think of the most when they think of PTSD, are distressing memories, nightmares, flashbacks, intense psychological distress, and psychological reactions. And we've talked about most of those in some past episodes. But so intrusion mainly into your thoughts, your brain, things that you can't really control.
A lot of imagery.
Yep.
The third area that it affects is a lot of avoidance. You start to avoid thinking or talking about the traumatic event. You just avoid it at all costs in your conversations or even just your thinking about it. You'll avoid external reminders. And so for someone, let's say you got in a car accident in a certain part of a city at a certain intersection, you'll avoid that intersection because of what happened at that intersection.
Yeah.
And so you'll avoid external reminders. Another, like, a symptom in this subcategory is the inability to remember important parts of the trauma and the inability to experience positive emotions. And so the part that I thought was interesting is the inability to remember important parts of the trauma. That's either through subconscious suppression, your brain trying to like hide these things because it's causing a lot of negative emotion, or you willingly and knowingly suppressing these emotions and just trying to forget them and not fully processing them, which leads to more symptoms of PTSD. So overall avoidance and suppression of thoughts about the traumatic event.
Yeah. And that one really does fascinate me because a lot of these is simply your brain trying to protect you, especially with avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is when you go through these traumatic events, your brain can literally like start to shut off certain areas so you don't remember it on purpose to protect you. And I think that's a really beautiful part of the brain is, I mean, a lot of the times it's not fun dealing with your silly brain and dealing with all the things it does to try and keep you alive. But in this instance, I think it's such a cool way of protecting you. And it can be really helpful because I would imagine most people that go through these events don't want to remember them anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Who wants to?
Yeah.
Who wants to experience these things?
Right.
So, yeah.
The last one here is cognitions and mood. So you have persistent, distorted blame or of self. So you blame yourself for what happened. And this is, again, I think the key words here, persistent and distorted. And so they're very persistent. They come up a lot, but they're not really quite what happened. So persistent, distorted blame of yourself or others and negative emotion. You have a negative emotional state.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so those are the 4 areas that affects through symptoms. And now going into the risk factors. And there's many risk factors that go into this. We kind of chose some of the most important ones, but first couple here. First risk factor is having had experienced other previous traumatic events. And so, like, let's say you've just had a life full of different types of traumatic events. You have one more traumatic event, and that you start to develop PTSD because of all the traumatic events kind of stacked up on top of each other. That's a huge risk factor. That's, from what I've read in the articles that you could read yourself, that's one of the biggest causes, biggest reasons. And along with that, of course, is a history of abuse, either sexual, physical, or emotional, different types of abuse. If you have that history, which in and of themselves are traumatic events, and so that's why those two are kind of linked together. Over time, those can just make you more vulnerable to developing these symptoms or this disorder of PTSD.
Yeah. And some of the next are family history of depression or PTSD. That can play, I think family history is a really big part in almost every single like psychological disorder.
It's a risk factor in everyone.
Yeah, if you have a family history of it. So if you have a history of depression or PTSD, and then you have substance abuse, even if you've had a history of substance abuse, that can affect your future as far as, being more susceptible to developing PTSD when you do experience that traumatic event. So drug and alcohol use and misuse can lead to a decreased ability to manage stress and therefore decreased ability to manage trauma, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you look at any study on the effects that drugs and alcohol, especially like the ones people use to self-medicate with when it comes to drugs, over time, I guess short term, it gets rid of those negative, unpleasant feelings. That's why you get a lot of war veterans, especially that become alcoholics, is because they're just trying to suppress those memories.
Yeah.
But as they do that, I mean, I really don't blame them. I'd probably be in the same case because that's a lot of hard things to deal with. But what that's doing is decreasing your own ability to cope with the stress and cope with the trauma, which is, if you're doing that before you experience the traumatic event, where you just have this, I guess, neural pathway of turning to alcohol and drugs to help you cope with your emotions. When that traumatic event comes, you're going to have a way harder time processing it.
Yeah.
And getting through it, I guess. So that's where that kind of comes in. So the next two here, first one, just overall poor coping skills, which of course can come from substance abuse, but you can be taught poor coping skills from your parents or from friends, family, whatever it is. So if you just have an overall lack of coping skills or were taught poor coping skills, this can lead to it can lead to mismanaged trauma, and then can lead to even blaming oneself for the trauma because you don't know how to handle it correctly, and thinking to yourself that you shouldn't have this problem because you don't know how to handle it. So just overall poor coping skills. And then a big one, pretty obvious though, is a lack of support from family, friends, and community. Like if you go through a traumatic event, let's say you are a victim of a sexual assault, and you don't get that support you need from your family, friends, or let's say like the police or whatever it is, you're going to feel lost and lonely, and your brain's going to turn to fight or flight mode and develop those memories straight into the fear center because you went all through that by yourself and you didn't get the support you need to overcome it. So that's a huge factor there.
The last one here is ongoing stress. And I mean, like we've talked about, and Austin said it perfectly, once it builds on top of each other, I mean, eventually that kind of goes with the first one, having experienced previous traumatic events. And if you have ongoing stress, like if work is stressing you out, your family's stressing you out, just life in general is stressing you out, then you experience that traumatic event, and that could be the event that just makes you snap, and you develop PTSD.
Like it could be I don't know, like a harmless, I don't want to say harmless, but like it's a person who doesn't have as much stress in life experiences that event, but doesn't develop PTSD because they weren't as stressed as you, but since you were so stressed and you had overall psychological problems, insert traumatic event, you're just not going to be able to cope with it, and then you develop PTSD. So
right, yeah. So those are the main risk factors that we chose to talk about. Of course, there are many more, but that's for you to read for yourself.
Go to the articles.
Now we're going to move on to diagnosis. This is very simple. So PTSD is categorized according to when symptoms occur and how long they last. There are 3 types of PTSD. There are, on top of what we talked about, acute symptoms last between 1 to 3 months after the event. Chronic, these symptoms last more than 3 months after the event. And delayed onset, which these symptoms don't appear until at least 6 months after the event. And so you need to have those symptoms that we talked about, and then these different kinds of course, that's why seeing a professional is important, because they will be able to put you in the correct category, and you'll be able to receive the correct help that you need.
Yeah, exactly. It's very important, especially for PTSD, to seek professional help. We're going to say this every time in every single episode of this series, that professional help, the diagnosis is so important, because you cannot diagnose yourself by reading one of these articles or listening to this podcast. Unfortunately, yeah, we can't diagnose you, mainly because we can't see, we don't know your problems, and also we're not even licensed yet. And so even if we were, we wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
So it's very important you reach out to a specialist and get diagnosed correctly so you can be treated correctly and receive treatment for your specific needs. And speaking of treatment, let's get into that now.
Let's do it.
Of course, there's medications to treat for symptoms, and we always chime on this every single episode, but PTSD is more so important that you seek therapy, because all you're going to do with medication is treat symptoms. And because it's really important with PTSD that you process the memories correctly and gain a better relationship to your traumatic memories.
Mm.
And medication is not going to do that. All it will do is raise your emotional baseline and help you alleviate some of the symptoms, which is an important process in healing. You might need medications for a certain amount of time to even get out of bed to go to therapy. And so that's an important part of the PTSD healing process. It is just such a small part of it, I guess, when it comes to actually healing. So medications, SSRIs, different types of anxiety relieving medications.
Yeah. And then, of course, like we've said, therapy is just king when it comes to dealing with PTSD instead of medications. I'm sure most people know that. Most of you probably know that. And the specific therapy that we want to talk about is EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Processing. Now, you might be saying, oh my gosh, that's weird. What is that?
What kind of hypnotherapy, hippie stuff is that?
Yeah, hippie stuff, man. But simply put, EMDR is a type of therapy with an 8-step process in which the individual is asked to recall traumatic images, while the therapist creates a sensory input such as a side-to-side eye movement or hand tapping. Again, there are different ways of doing EMDR. Each therapist has their own style they prefer, but some of the most popular two is the side-to-side eye movement and the hand tapping.
Yeah, and that might sound weird, and it does, honestly, even to me now, knowing about it. It is really it's weird, but it works, and it works very well. Countless studies have been done. It's been proven to work. And it does this by basically facilitating the accessing and processing of the traumatic memories and other adverse life experience to find an adaptive solution. And this happens through essentially relieving and reprocessing the memory through the higher functioning part of the brain rather than the emotional and fear parts of the brain. So the eye movement, the sensory input is basically a way to shut off the emotional part of the brain. And in its simplest terms, that's basically what it's doing. It's shutting off the emotional part of the brain, recalling the memories, and letting them get processed through those higher functioning parts of the brain to be processed by a not so fear-based, stress-based part of the brain. It's just going to see the memories as they are and allow you to create a better relationship to them. And so you do those sensory inputs, tapping, eye movement, audio input, I guess, audio stimulus.
Vibrations.
Vibrations is a big one. Just to stimulate your senses, and that chew 5 gum, stimulate your senses. You won't chew 5 gum, maybe you will. But to stimulate your senses enough to where it kind of turns on that higher functioning part of the brain, shuts off the lower functioning emotional part. And as you're doing that, you then relive the most traumatic parts of the memory talking to the therapist.
It's kind of the therapist, he or she will guide you through it.
Exactly, yeah.
And you relive and process them in a healthy way instead of unhealthy way, which is the way you did it in the first time you went through the event.
Yeah.
Not your fault. It's just the way it happened. Mm-hmm. And that's normal. That's okay.
Yeah, because
there are better ways to process traumatic events. And the way the brain does it, a lot of the times, it tries, but it's not the greatest.
It's wired to process those memories through the amygdala, which is the fear-based stress response, emotional, because it's like we talked about 100 times before on the podcast, and especially the series. The brain's goal is to keep you alive, and its idea or its theory is that by remembering these memories through stressful emotional memories, you'll avoid them and it won't happen again, so therefore you live longer and you survive.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is good for survival, but it's not good for mental health.
It's not good well-being. For living.
It's not good for, it's good for survival and not living. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And so by allowing ourselves to process it through the higher functioning, we can, like I said earlier, create that better relationship with the memory and not relive it every time we get a trigger.
Yeah.
And so it's really just a way to reprocess. Like it's in the name, EMDR is a way for you to reprocess your traumatic memories so they don't bug you as much anymore.
Yeah.
That's really all it is.
And it's particularly used for PTSD and trauma.
That's what it was developed for. The initial research was done in hopes to help with, I believe it was just war veterans. I think that's what it was originally, was to help with the PTSD experienced by war veterans. And since then, I think the original studies were done in the late 80s.
Yeah, I was going to say like 1980s, so it's fairly new.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, especially in the grand scheme of psychology, it's just like acceptance and commitment therapy, the thing that we both love. It's generally new, and it was created around the same time. And it's been through countless studies and shown to be effective.
And it's starting to gain a lot of more traction too as time goes on.
Yeah, and it's not just something that a person can start doing. To be officially certified to be a EMDR clinician, what is a 50-hour course, online
it's like
course?
50 hours in
9 months.
A 9-month period of like being observed doing.
Yeah, like basically being in a practicum residency.
Yeah, I don't fully know the whole deal of that, but
yeah, but it's a certification. It's a legit thing. You have to learn how to do it, and then it's just like any other specification or speciality in therapy. You have to learn how to do it properly, and you become a certified EMDR therapist. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that sounds pretty good to me, I want to try it out. Like, I have some PTSD I want to work through. Yeah. We're going to link a website or the article we read from. It's emdr.com, very aptly named. At the very top of that, at least on the mobile version, on the very top of that website, there is a Find a Clinician button. From my understanding, you could click or touch that, press it, and you input your information, and it'll find a certified EMDR therapist in your area that you can go to and start working through your traumatic events. It's a really cool tool, actually.
Yeah, that's really cool. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope you learned something new about PTSD today. I know we did.
I definitely did.
Creating this episode, and it's been a lot of fun doing that. But another reminder to, when you use the phrase, the term PTSD, just be aware that there are those that really do struggle with PTSD, and it can affect their life tremendously. And so this is just another gentle reminder to
watch your language.
Watch your language, and just care for people, and realize that every single person is going through something that you have no idea about, and they're going through their own like micro traumas in a sense in their life. And yeah, it may not be PTSD, but they each have their own thing in their life that is causing distress.
Yeah.
And so watch your language, be nice, and all will be well.
Always be aware of what could be going on, because you know what you're dealing with, and it's very likely that every person you pass on the street is going through an equally or harder thing in their life that's causing just as much stress for you as it is for them, or for them that is for you. We all have our things, like Enoch said, so this is your daily reminder from the What About Therapy boys.
I guess your weekly reminder.
Weekly reminder, yeah, not daily. Unless you listen to this daily, which would be awesome.
Hey, that'd be cool. Bump up our views.
Yeah, please do that. No, you have other things to do. But yeah, it's a good reminder, just be kind. Kindness will change the world, honestly. It's as simple as that.
It's great. Mm-hmm. So again, thanks for listening. If you made it this far, you're just amazing. Please, it would mean the world to us if you would leave a 5-star review.
Yes, it would.
On Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Cast.
Yep, Amazon.
You don't have to leave them on all of them yourself. Just whatever you listen on.
Yeah, if you're on YouTube.
Yeah, we're also on YouTube. I forgot to mention, and we'll probably mention this in our main series on Tuesdays, but we have stopped videos as of now for YouTube, just because that's not something that we, I guess, necessarily.
Most of our listeners are on audio only, basically.
Audio only. And so there's, if you really love the videos, I'm sorry.
Can't see our faces anymore.
I know. Sad. But you can also follow us on Instagram, and we share reels there, some videos, quotes at What About Therapy on Instagram. Not on Facebook, unfortunately, but Instagram seems to be king nowadays.
Yeah, it's also a good way to reach out to us if you have ideas for an episode or want to talk to us, have questions.
Yeah.
Want to share a story. We love that stuff. We don't really get much of it, and we'd love it if you do. So
yeah, and again, leave a review. You can, if you say something nice, we'll read it on the podcast just for you.
Exactly.
And yeah. Anyways, great. You all of you, we love you all. You're the OGs if you made it this far. You're great. You're amazing. And have a good week. We'll talk to you next Tuesday.
See you guys.
What about therapy? What about therapy? What about therapy? Yeah. What about therapy? What about therapy? What about therapy? Yeah. what about therapy? What about therapy?